Thomas, are you optimistic, pessimistic that any sort of deal, whether Mexico and Canada or just Mexico, gets done before the midterms?
I'm not optimistic. I think it's more likely that you'll see a deal move forward with Mexico and Canada asking for more time. How Congress reacts to that and how the president reacts to that is what remains to be seen.
What do you think about the point that Mike Santoli just made about, we've got this anonymous op-ed, the resistance inside the Trump administration just hitting the New York Times, obviously the Bob Woodward book that's getting a lot of attention right now, and some of the backlash that the president is facing domestically. He's constantly faced it, but whether that could influence his negotiations on trade.
Well, I think there's no question this White House needs good news, and there's nothing the president likes better than good news on trade. And it's certainly true in the past that there's been a lot of run-up to tension in negotiations, whether it's North Korea or even in the Korea Free Trade Agreement before, and it's been followed by a relatively modest agreement and victory being declared. That said, the outstanding items for Canada are really hard to see exactly where they're going to agree without the U.S. Moving back from some of that. In particular on dairy and on this intellectual property issue around medicines. Canada would have to change its laws in order to back down to the Trump agreement's position. And on the IP side, it's already in the Mexico deal, so it'll be hard from the U.S. standpoint to back down from that. So there's a real tension there.
Thomas, given that the economy does remain as strong as it does, and if that does maintain until November, how does all of this trade issues play out for the midterms? Is it something that still helps the president, even if no final deal is done or not?
So I think what is likely to happen is the president is likely to argue that Congress should pass the bilateral deal with Mexico and Canada can join at a later date. And it'll really be up to Congress itself, its rules as to what qualifies under the executive branches and Congress's agreement about having an up or down vote on a trade agreement. Ultimately, there's no one else can sue under that. It's Congress's job to decide, and that's going to fall in the hands of Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. And that's ultimately in the president's interest. That said, a lot of people really care about the details in having Canada involved. So what I think you're more likely to see is a president declare victory, Congress say wait and see, Canada wait and see, and this agreement will sit.
Sarat, as someone with a lot of money in this market, are you nervous at all about the way the Canada talks in particular are going?
Actually, I'm not. I think so much of this is negotiation, and it's going to be a win-win, quote, for both sides. Because I think if one of them really, Canada, we saw their markets are down already. They're not going to really dig in because it's going to cause more pain for them, and then it'll actually show that we're winning. So I think both sides need to show they got something out of it and kind of move on, because this seems to be more about
in other words, it's just politics.
It is just about politics until we kind of get all of this resolved.
Kevin, you mentioned that it's not a particularly optimistic moment for Canadian investors north of the border, but do you think people can still be optimistic about the U.S. equity markets?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Canadians that only invested in Canada in the last 2 years have wildly underperformed. Most Canadians diversify their portfolios by holding a large portion in the S&P 500. But Canada faces some other problems that have emerged in the last 2 weeks that unfortunately are happening at the same time of this NAFTA renegotiation. The government nationalized the Kinder Morgan pipeline when Kinder Morgan put up their hands and basically said Canada is no longer investable because any large-term infrastructure gets plagued in provincial and federal courts through litigation tied up for years. They just gave up the ghost and sold the pipeline for $4.5 billion to the government just a couple of weeks ago. And then really, unfortunately, the federal government itself, through its court system, ruled against the pipeline altogether in another set of litigation. So the Canadian people bought a pipeline that is now basically worthless. And that's plaguing the federal government. This is a whole series of bad news events. And of course, the Canadian dollar has reacted with a decline of over 1% just in the last 2 weeks. So this has not been good. And all of a sudden, we're now debating, are we going to have a better NAFTA or worse NAFTA after this is over? If you're optimistic a deal will get done, and I'm not, in the short term. It's not going to be one that was better than the last. It's going to be worse for Canada, which is why I think the Canadian domestic equity markets have reflected some pessimism and can't seem to get positive. They're negative on the year while the S&P is up 10%. That gives you an idea of the delta that's occurring here.